Welcome to episode 7 of the Busy Aviation podcast. On the show today, I have a really interesting guest who is an accomplished aviator, but also a teacher, author and presenter. Peter Docker, or Group Captain Peter Docker, as he's known by his more formal title, teaches leadership that is focused on commitment and human connection. His book, Leading from the Jumpseat, has recently been published, and it's a privilege to chat with him here today. Hi Peter, welcome to the Busy Aviation podcast. Really great to have you on. A slightly more unusual guest, really, so far for our podcast, in that I was approached by your publicist to read your book, and it's been fascinating so far. But to get started, I think, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your career so far and intended route, and your passions as well?
Sure. Well, Chris, first of all, thanks so much for having me on your show. It's great to have the opportunity to talk. And yes, my publicist did contact you, but this is more about having a conversation about things that, where I think we share a passion. But in order to answer your question, I go back, good heavens, longer than I care to remember now. I started in the Royal Air Force, a bit like you, I think. I joined the age of about 20 as a pilot, and spent 25 years in the Royal Air Force. I was promoted to group captain eventually. But during my time, I flew VC-10, the good old VC-10 aircraft, one of the fastest around.
Been in the back of those a few times.
Yeah, absolutely. But a trusty old beast. So flew that in the transport, passenger, and later on the air refueling role, which was exciting. And during my time, I flew the Prime Minister, who at the time was Margaret Thatcher. So I was one of her pilots. And also later on in my career, I led people in combat in the 2003 Iraq War. I was the force commander for the British air refueling operation. But then, in the Air Force, you get to the stage where you're promoted and you no longer are flying. You're looking after the people that fly. And I did a number of different roles. I taught at the Defense Academy on leadership. I negotiated with the Russians when the Berlin Wall came down on behalf of NATO. I led a £13 billion project, which was the biggest at the time. That involved A330 aircraft, which I learned to fly, which was a great experience. And then I left the Air Force because I thought there was more I could do. And I joined a consultancy that focused in high-risk environments, working in oil and gas, construction, mining, where people often got killed or injured. And so we went in and we helped people to work in a way, lead in a way where everyone went home safe every day. And that was a wonderful experience. I worked in the Middle East, in Kazakhstan, in Africa, and Europe. And then after about 3 years, I thought, right, there's more I can do. And around about that time, there was a fellow called Simon Sinek who brought out a book called Start With Why, was his first one.
Very well known.
I worked alongside Simon for about 7 or 8 years, helping to take his message around the world. I co-wrote with Simon and David Mead the book Find Your Why, which to date has sold about 500,000 copies, I think, in 26 languages. And in the process, I visited, in total in my life, about 93 countries and worked in practically every industry you can imagine, including aviation, including space, which is fascinating, and traveled to, those countries in 200 odd cities. So it's been an extraordinary time. In the last couple of years, I stepped away from Simon and focused on pulling together everything I've learned in my different careers to put in the book, Leading from the Jumpseat, a copy of which you have in your hand, I think.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah, and we were just, before we started to hit the record button, we were just talking about the book. And I have to admit that I'm probably, 95% of the way through it. And it was something we'll talk about a little bit later on, I think, but it's an excellent book. Thank you. And you've got a fascinating background. And as you said right at the start, so we have similar backgrounds. I think yours has been a little bit more exciting and varied than mine. But my 18 years in the Air Force. But it's really great to have you here, and it's really interesting to get that summary of where you've been. And then I suppose if we looked at that in detail, we could probably talk for days, but we haven't got time for that, unfortunately. you mentioned joining the Air Force and back in those days, and you flew the VC-10. Yeah. And in the book, you've mentioned that you did it. Your passion was really to help people. You thought it would, you could join the Air Force to absolutely help other people, which a lot of people do, and it's admirable. But did you ever have any specific passion for flying? Was there something, a moment in your life where you thought, I really need to fly?
Well, my introduction to flying really was when I was at university, and I joined the University Air Squadron, Birmingham University Air Squadron. And I was fortunate enough to learn to fly the Bulldog then. And to this day, I can still remember coming across the railway line embankment, which was on the approach to Cosford Airfield, where we operated from. And I think I was a little bit low, and the train just hesitated before it pulled out the station. But so that was a wonderful experience. But to your point, I was driven actually to join the Air Force in 1982, which is thousands of years ago. It feels like, because at that time the Falkland Islands was invaded by Argentina. And I remember it was nothing to do with the politics. I was just so incensed that a regime was enforcing their will on a population that had no choice but considered themselves very much to be British, that I left university halfway through and chose to join the Royal Air Force full time, because I felt I would then be part of a team who in the future could help those who couldn't help themselves. And well, I'd learned to fly, and that was really enjoyable. So I thought, well, let's do that. And so I left university halfway through my course, in fact, and joined the Royal Air Force because I wanted to be a part of a team who I felt could intervene in future situations and help those who couldn't help themselves. And so joined the Royal Air Force. Obviously, the natural thing to do was to join as a pilot. And I was fortunate that the Air Force offered me the opportunity to do that. And it's only looking back now where I think I fully appreciate how fortunate I was to get that training.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the same, and I think it all comes in such a rush. And I think the whole kind of Armed Forces career is so intense. Yeah. It's only when you look back. I think as well you do look back a little bit with rose-tinted spectacles. Certainly, I do. I certainly seem to have forgotten all the hard times, and I've started to think about more all the really good times. I look back with affection, particularly to the Nimrod. But I've forgotten those 15-hour trips where you just wanted to get off. I've totally forgotten those. But I have to remind myself now and then when I get all nostalgic, and my two boys are very keen aviators as well, and and I start talking about it, and I think they go, Dad, it's why did you ever leave Nimrods? It sounds awesome. And I said, well, there were. Sounds
awesome. Yeah, and the only aircraft, in my knowledge, that chose to shut down two engines whilst low level over the sea. You know, what a great scheme that was.
Yeah, it was quite interesting, but it was all well controlled. Yeah, no, good stuff. And so that's the passion for flying. And do you still have that? Do you manage to fly at all now, or is that a distant memory?
Well, interesting question, because it's something that. It sounds odd to say this, but I'm wrestling with at the moment. So when I left the Air Force back in 2007, to be honest, Chris, I wasn't in great shape mentally. The toll of taking 200 people or so to war, and thankfully bring them all back, but that rested heavily on me and took quite a toll. It was less about what happened; it was more about what could have happened. And I took that responsibility really very, very heavily. And so when I left the Air Force, I went into the consulting. It had nothing to do with the military or flying, which surprised many, particularly since I had a nice brand new shiny A330 ticket. And I feel guilty that I wasted that in some ways. But no, I think that there was also, it got to the stage, flying the VC-10, bless it. It was built like a brick outhouse, to be polite about it. which I was very thankful for on occasion. But towards the end of my flying career in that aircraft, it was a case of what emergency we're going to have today. So perhaps it was the onset of reality that started to kick in. But so I left flying. I hung up my flying gloves. But there has always been something that pulls me back in that direction. And last weekend, my daughter, who is grown up, she's 30, for a birthday treat, we took her down to Gloucester Airport. And she had a flight for 40 minutes or so with the instructor. And I watched her from the coffee shop as they taxied out in this little light single prop aircraft. And it was going through my head, the radio calls that you make and your considerations on takeoff for engine failure, etc. Just because I remember it so well.
Slightly less complicated an engine failure in a light piston, of course, than an engine failure probably in a VC-10. There is only one choice.
Well, yeah, indeed. It simplifies things, doesn't it?
Yeah, but, in some respects.
In some respects, yes. But so we'll see. I think, and you might be able to appreciate this, Chris. When I was flying, I took great pride in flying to the best of my ability all of the time, and there's also always a purpose to it. And I think the cost of maintaining any sort of license privately is so large. That's one thing that holds you back. But also, I have to find a really good purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than just pottering about. I think that's the challenge. Yeah. So we'll see.
Oh, good. We'll I went back to flying fixed wing because I've always had a fixed wing license, and I went back to it it must have been about 4 years ago now. For the same reasons, I needed a purpose to it though, and I absolutely love it, and it has rekindled all those early days of flying around in Cessnas and stuff like that for me. I wasn't fortunate enough to do the University Air Squadron, but I now have my own little aircraft, but I like going places. That's the purpose. The purpose is and it's quite fast, it's aerobatic, and it's not hugely easy to fly. So every time you go flying, it's a challenge. But I know what you mean. Flying around in circles does not hold much interest. No, and it is, and one of the things you've just pointed out there, it is phenomenally expensive. If you think, I mean, it's like I compare it to having, my wife used to have horses, or a horse, which was like a financial black hole. You just used to throw money at it every day.
Totally.
Yeah. And they're very similar aircraft. Mine, I convinced myself that it's more economic to have your own than rather than booking somebody else's, but that's just really, really not true.
Yeah, I was going to say that was a good conversation you had with yourself in the mirror.
I've got a very good spreadsheet.
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, it's man maths, isn't it? But I've effectively hung up my flying gloves now, but handed it over to my son, who is a Royal Navy pilot.
Oh,
now. And,
interesting.
He's been training for many years, helicopters. And I have to say with unabashed pride that in May, I'll be going down to see him awarded his wings.
Oh, awesome.
Which is at a much later stage. As you go to an operational squadron and you're operationally ready, that's when you get your wings, which is a much later stage than when I received mine, when I went through training. But that will be a great moment. And you and he could have great conversations about helicopters and patting your head and stirring your stomach at the same time. So
I think like you said about hanging out your flying gloves, for me, I've been involved with helicopters now for so long. I have to say I don't have a massive passion for them. I still have a massive passion for flying and all things aviation, but helicopters, I still enjoy it, but it's not something I have a huge passion for. So it's because I've done it as a job for so long, as you said, and I've got to an age where we're pretty much in the aircraft we fly systems managers. It's very, very automated. I mean, compared to something like a VC-10, there's no comparison, and we're very much push. Even in a helicopter these days, very much push button, and you are there waiting for something to go wrong, which fortunately doesn't happen very often, but that's the reality of modern flying, in the commercial world.
Well, it is, isn't it? and it's nice to acquire the skills where you feel confident and capable of handling the situation when the automatics fall over, because of course they sometimes can.
Yeah.
I live vicariously, which is a big word for me, but I lived through my son's experience when he went and did some of his training with the US Army over at Fort Rucker in Alabama. And whereas the military in this country, training helicopters, you'll get 1 or 2 aircraft taken off in the morning. Each morning, they had 300 aircraft get airborne.
Unbelievable.
In 3 waves, 100. It was absolutely ridiculous. And some of the flying they did was ultra low level at night on MVGs I think you did between 0 and 20 feet was, their height. And that I think must have been quite exciting.
Yeah, done that. Don't need to go back to it. Thanks.
Well, perhaps it's better for people much younger than you and I, Chris.
100% it is. Yeah. I have total admiration for people that my age, and I know the Air Force now as well. There's lots of older pilots in there. When I think probably when we were in 55, even if you stayed in a flying post for all that time, you were gone. And I know now of people that have gone way past 55 and they're still flying on operational squadrons. And hats off to them, I say. I really do.
And I think that is a sign of the times as well, that there is a shortage of pilots, and the training system can't seem to push them out to the operational units quickly enough. So that probably bodes well for people who are a little bit older and want to stay flying.
Yes, there's I'm in the other end of the spectrum. My youngest son is actually just applying to be a Royal Navy pilot and is some way through the process, so that's quite interesting. But he shows me lots of memes from the internet of particularly the RAF P8 crews, which obviously I've got a little bit of a connection with, and it's quite scary when I see people that I was on the squadron with in 1986 and they're still there and they've come back, which is
good on them.
So there's quite lots of memes, I think, going around about the age of the P8 crews. But very experienced crews, so, and I'm sure they'll do if they were anything like the Nimrod crews, they'll do an awesome job, because there was no doubt we were the best of the world at it back then, and I hope we haven't lost that, and now it's come back. That's really great. Thanks, Peter. You talked a little bit about the VC-10 there. I've flown. I don't know if I've ever flown on the flight deck, but I've certainly flown backwards in the passenger variant. For anyone that's listening, the VC-10 had all the seats facing backwards as actually a very good safety idea, and only not adopted by the airlines is because passengers don't want to fly backwards.
Well, indeed.
Yeah, but it's a fantastic aircraft. The fastest airliner in the world?
Second only to Concorde.
Oh, well, yeah. I suppose I should leave Concorde out, really. So it's got afterburners. I don't think that don't count, does it?
No, it would be. It was faster by some margin, one could say. But no, the VT-10 was a quick old bird. We used to cruise around at, from memory, Mach 0.82. But I think it was 0.966 was its maximum Mach operating, or 992, one of those. But I have actually gone supersonic in the VC-10, not intentionally, but we're flying over in the States at night, which added to the drama. And we're up at about 33,000 feet. And I think we're around about the Rockies region. So there was obviously some topographical action going on. And we found ourselves picked up by a standing wave. And it was, to be honest, rather alarming, because our speed went from our nice steady Mach 0.82 down to about 0.6 and then up to 1 point something and then back down. And, you have a procedure for dealing with that. But what the co-pilots didn't recognize was, like the rest of us, it was going to happen. And he was eating his lunch at the time.
a proper AT crew.
Oh, absolutely. He was eating his lunch, and then he was wearing his lunch as it was thrown about the flight deck. But yeah, that was quite unsettling. But we did actually cracked the sound barrier there for a short period.
But
we were glad to. Well, yeah. The only other time I've cracked the sound barrier was my last flight in the Air Force. I flew the Typhoon.
Oh, fantastic!
And it was a great week. I went the fastest and the slowest I've ever been in an aircraft. The first was with the Typhoon, and it was in one of their twin-seat trainers, and so I had an instructor pilot with me. And I remember as we lined up on the numbers, ready for departure, I thought, what am I doing here? Because this is going to be quite interesting. And indeed it was. We accelerated down the runway for a, what do they call it? A high performance departure and climb. And he snapped to the vertical. And I was just watching the altimeter go as it was winding up. And then the voice over the intercom was heard, which the female voice says, warning, transonic, which was just warning you from a tactical perspective, you're going to break the sound barrier.
Even going vertically.
Yeah. And now, of course, you don't hear anything, but from a tactical perspective, you need to be aware of that in case it gives away your presence. But anyway, we carried on up, and we'd been cleared to 55,000 feet with flight level 550. Amazing. And I was flying at this stage, and the instructor said, right, as we pass 40,000, you need to start leveling off, because otherwise we're going to bust our height. So there we are. We leveled off at flight level 550 at Mach 2 with this clear blue sky over the North Sea. And
that's kind of curvature of the Earth altitudes as well, isn't it, on a clear day?
Yeah, you can. And it was starting to get a little bit darker up there at that altitude. But, it's very undramatic, that. And then he took control, flipped us inverted, and we dived down to about 20,000 feet. And then he said, right, here we are at Mach 1. He said, do whatever aerobatics you like. And it was just phenomenal because, and the G suit that we had, which is effectively a full body G suit, meant that we were pulling, more Gs than I care to think about now. And I didn't have any G tolerance at that stage, having flown big aircraft for a while. And I was talking to him as I'm talking to you now. Phenomenal piece of kit. So, yeah, that was a fun time. And then later on that week, I went to do a graduation up at RAF Shawbury. And I said, well, I'll go and do the graduation, but send a helicopter, a twin squirrel down. Got a field outside with the instructor pilot because I'd like to fly a helicopter. So I flew the helicopter up to Shawbury.
Which will have trumped the Typhoon experience by, immeasurably.
Well, absolutely. Well, it was more of a challenge when, as we were approaching RF Shawbury, the instructor said, right, we'll start to switch off some of the computers now until you've got no computer assistance at all. Then I started to work a little bit harder, I have to say.
raw helicopter flying in a modern, the twin squirrel's not that modern, but without the stability systems in, is always interesting. We used to do the same in the Falklands. We used to have the F3s down there, and we always used to invite them to come flying with us. And if they were this was in the Sea King, which was incredibly stable. You could teach teach your granny to hover it, to be honest. Although I don't want to give away that, but it wasn't that difficult to hover. It was like a giant block of flats. But if they were doing too well, we would just knock the stabilization system out, and then it gets a little bit lively, just to make sure. And we always used to make sure that the navigators left it in, so they did incredibly well compared to the F3 pilots. So as soon as the pilots got in, if they thought we were getting it, the nav would be sat behind us watching his buddy. And we just knock this stab out and go, you're not doing very well. I said, the navs can do better than this. Anyway.
Well, it's good just to rebalance things and egos, doesn't it?
You've got to rebalance if it's the fast jet guys. Brilliant. We'll move away from the Air Force in a moment, Peter, but it's really interesting, and you've got some great stories. In fact, actually, my last flight in the Air Force was also in a fast jet. I luckily had a friend, and I was at Lossiemouth, and I got a Tornado. It's not strictly true, actually. I call it my last flight, but unfortunately in the morning I had to do a rotor tune in a Sea King, but I'm discarding that. I tell people my last flight was
I think a good skills there too.
Was in a tornado, which again was probably not the same experience as a typhoon, but for a helicopter pilot, what took me by surprise was how quiet the whole thing was. Obviously, I was in the back seat, but it was just silent. And we demonstrated the party. Apparently, it's got one part. I mean, it's a bomber at the end of the day, but one party trick was to just let the speed. You just come back to idle, and you let the speed wash right off to minimums. And then you push right through to, I think it's to afterburner, to combat power, and the acceleration on the tornado. I presume that was a GR1. I don't want to show my ignorance of tornado types, but it was a pin you in the back of the seat moment. And my friend who was flying said, just be careful when we reach. I can't remember what speed it was, but you need to pull 40 to 50 degrees nose up, otherwise we will go supersonic. Which was interesting, because I think it was never really designed for that kind of action, but it was good. So one last thing on the RAF. So is there any one thing? I mean, I know it's quite some time ago, but is there any one thing particular that you miss about it, or do you miss a lot about it? I don't know. It's probably a leading question.
Well, of course, there's the rose-tinted spectacles effect, isn't there? So I think when I look back, I just really appreciate my time and the opportunities that I had. And yes, I could say I missed this, I missed that, but I think that's futile, because I can't go back, and also I probably don't remember the full context of the time and the frustrations and all the rest of it. Yeah. But no, I really enjoyed my time, and I think I was very, very fortunate.
Yeah. And I speak to a lot of people. Obviously, are still involved in aviation, and particularly helicopters. So we're surrounded by ex-service pilots, and I think you meet two different types of people. Actually, you meet the people that have made the break and have gone. And then you meet some people who haven't really ever made the break, and there's always that. Oh, but back in the day, and when we did this and when we did that, which I find sometimes a little bit frustrating, particularly from a management point of view, is that you need to move on. And it was, you said, it was a fantastic experience, but it's just an experience, and now you move on to the next one.
That's right. And I think that's a good way of looking at life as well. We could spend all of our time looking backwards, but it's better to look forwards and what you can create and what you can go on to do.
Yeah, and that leads nicely into the book, actually, Peter. So leading from the Jumpseat. I say I've already admitted that I haven't quite finished it. My homework I've not done. That was the story of my life, which is I think before we start recording, I got to flight lieutenant, you got to group captain. So I should have been faster at reading. Could have worked harder, I think the school report said. What made you write the book? Is there anything in particular? Is there another passion? I know you talked about. I want to talk a little bit about your time with Simon as well, just after this. But is there something in particular that sparked? Because I've never written a book, so I'd imagine it's quite a big undertaking.
Yeah, I mean the book, the full title, "Leading from the Jumpseat: How to Create Extraordinary Opportunities by Handing Over Control." And this is, well, it draws from the metaphor of a flight deck being the microcosm of leadership. And we can see great leadership there and very poor leadership too. And the book opens with a story of when I found myself on the jump seat shortly after takeoff in a VC-10 at San Francisco with a newly certified captain in the left-hand seat, and we were about 500 feet. We had an emergency. And what I then chose to do in the next couple of seconds would dictate whether we will survive or not. And I chose to do absolutely nothing, because in that moment, I didn't need to lead. I needed to be a great follower. I needed to have the captain, Callum, feel that I had his back and that I entrusted him to get on and do what he needed to do. And to be honest, if I didn't entrust him to sort out the situation, I would have had no business signing him up as a fully qualified captain the day before. So this gave me the notion of leading from the jump seat because, we all hand over control at some stage in our life. If we're a boss of a company, if we lead a team, or even as a parent, our kids will grow up and leave home and start to lead their own lives. So handing over control is inevitable. And leading from the jump seat is very much about, well, how do we lead in such a way that we prepare our people to take forward those things that are really important to us once we've taken that step back? And it turns out that when you lead with that intention, it creates extraordinary opportunities in the moment, in the present, and equips your team to take on the greatest challenges, as well as do a better job in day-to-day business. So that was the idea behind Jumpseat leadership. But the book is just a container, really, for all the things that I've learned over the years with all the experiences that I've had. And I've just been so fortunate in my life, I think, to have had these experiences. I wanted to share not only those stories, but the message behind the stories and what I've learned from them, because then I hope that other people can put those ideas into practice. And the book is very much a how-to guide. At the end of each chapter, there is how to, we call it consider this section, for you to consider, regardless of what stage you are in your life and career, how to put those ideas in each chapter, how to put them into practice.
Yeah, now that is slightly different to a lot of other kind of leadership coaching type books that I've read, is that as Peter, you just described, at the end of each chapter, you've got, I think there's flying, and then there's, let me get this straight, I think you'll know this much better than me. Sorry.
I'll take you through very quickly. Yeah. It builds on the metaphor of being a pilot. There are 4 stages in life, really. There's learning to fly, there's flying, teaching others to fly, and then leading from the jump seat. So the first of those, learning to fly, is a metaphor for figuring out, what's deeply important to you in life. What's really important? I'm not talking about your latest iPhone or car or whatever, but no, what are those things that are the non-negotiables, the things that will drive you forward even in times of uncertainty or chaos? Because when you can latch onto those, then it helps to guide you as you face uncertain times. I mentioned earlier the Falklands War. One of the things that came out of that for me that is still a non-negotiable for me is the notion of mutual respect. Mm-hmm. And so that's one driver that guides me as I move forward. But then, perhaps you've been at college or you've done an apprenticeship or whatever, you get into your job and you're doing really well in the job. And you're flying. Now, if you're a pilot, you might be literally flying. But, if you're a computer programmer or a gardener or whatever it happens to be, you're good at it and you're in flow. That's what I refer to as the flying stage. But then after a while, typically, you'll probably get promoted if you're really good at it, what you do. And then all of a sudden, you've got this team of people to look after. And that's when you have the opportunity to teach others to fly. And that's the third stage of Jumpseat leadership, where you pass on your expertise and lifting them up.
I think that's an interesting point in that one, Peter. Sorry to interrupt it. Just people are promoted generally because they're good at the job that they were doing. And
exactly.
And we see that a lot where, in my business where, if you're very good, if you're a very able pilot, maybe you're a very able instructor, you quite often are the person that is promoted, but it doesn't actually make you a good manager. And that's a very difficult transition. Sorry, I interrupted the flow, but I think that was one of the points that I picked up. I think you made it in the book as well, is that it's quite difficult that generally we promote, not just in aviation, but in all industry, we promote people that are very good at technical subjects, but we don't necessarily promote people that are very good managers. But of course, sometimes it's catch-22.
Yeah. I mean, it was a good interruption there, Chris, because this is an issue that I see in most companies, many companies I work with, and it's our system, really. When you're at school, often you identify things that you're good at. So perhaps you'll go on to college or university to specialize even more and become better at them. And then you get hired for that role. Let's just say computer programmer, for example. You get hired because you're skilled at computer programming. And then, to your point, if you get really good at it in that job, you'll get promoted. And all of a sudden, you're no longer doing the programming. You're looking after the people who are doing the programming. But we give folks very little training to make that transition. But here's the thing. We've been rewarded up to that point for knowing the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then we're thrust into this position of managing a team where it's not about knowing the answer. It's about knowing the important questions to ask. Because if we're the one that has to know the answer all the time, we become the constriction in the pipe. And our team can only progress as fast as our own knowledge allows us to progress. But when we train, and this is part of Jumpseat leadership, when we train ourselves to lead when we don't know the answer, then we're no longer the constriction in the pipe. And instead, we're drawing on the collective genius of our team to figure out the solutions to the challenges that we're facing. And we accelerate, our velocity of progress increases. And the reason that's so important is because then it equips us to lead in situations when we genuinely don't know the answer, in times of uncertainty. And heaven only knows we've had a couple of years of great uncertainty in most industries around. So it equips us to lead better in those situations. So that's a major transition point, really, for people to adopt Jumpseat leadership.
Yeah, and I was just having a think there how that relates back to the flight deck, and you can absolutely see how that fits in, because on the flight deck, there's a captain, and a multi-crew aircraft. I mean, I came from my last few years was flying search and rescue with 4 crew, and on Nimrod there were 13 crew, and not everyone can see each other, so there's no body language, and it's a difficult thing to command. It's a difficult thing to lead, particularly when you can't see each other. And that's true for helicopters as well. Slightly easier on big transport aircraft, but I can see how that fits in, because the captain doesn't necessarily know everything, and to be fair, shouldn't really have to know everything, because, as you say, you really are playing your team members so that you're working on their knowledge. I mean, now most modern airlines are two pilot. The flight engineer has gone. You had a navigator in the heaven forbid in the VC-10, and the flight deck was a busy little place. But you can absolutely see that, and it's something that I'm in my role in my full-time day job when I'm not doing this is something we always put across, is that you're not expected to know everything, but you are expected to be able to manage your crew in a way that you come out with the best outcome. And I think in terms of leadership, I sit there every day because I fly a desk most of the time, and I've been thrust into a fairly senior leadership role, with having come from being just a chief pilot, well, not just a chief pilot, but a chief pilot. And it's difficult. It is very difficult, and dealing with people is the hardest part of any management role.
Well, it is, because people are complex, not complicated. Complicated is like a computer program, lines and lines and lines of code, like that control the services of an Airbus. Lines and lines and lines of code. It's complicated, but one line of code always follows the other. Leading people is complex, because one action does not necessarily have the same reaction. It's not repeatable. So that is the definition of complexity. But here's the thing, the big danger when we're put into a role where we're leading a team, our ego can come forward, because we like to be the person who knows the answer. And that has got no place in any team. It certainly doesn't have a place on the flight deck. And I recount the story in the book of the Tenerife disaster back in March 1977, where the KLM Captain Van Zanten, he had such a high role in that organization. He was the senior training captain who was literally the poster pilot, appeared on all the advertisements for KLM. But it was because he didn't listen and confirm that they had clearance for takeoff, when in fact they didn't have clearance. And he rolled down that runway in the fog and hit the Pan American jumbo.
Despite being told that.
Well, yeah. I mean, the first officer and the flight engineer both made a tentative intervention, but the cockpit gradient, as we know it, where the seniority of the captain was so great compared to the seniority of the other crew members, they didn't have the courage really to speak up. Now, the only good thing that perhaps came out of that, and we must remember 583 people lost their lives on that day. Perhaps one good thing that came out of that, one good legacy, was the advent of what's known as CRM these days, crew resource management, where, and I remember being taught and practicing this in the Air Force, where the most junior flight net member can speak up if they perceive something has been missed or is wrong. And I remember as a boss of a squadron, I commanded 101 Squadron, I would often fly with some very junior pilots. And as I walked onto the flight deck and sat down, I'd turn to them and say, right, before we go anywhere, I want you to remember your job is to monitor what I'm doing and pick me up if you think I've made a mistake or I've missed something. That is your job. And of course, just by saying that, not only do you create an environment where hopefully you all stay safe, but also you're lifting up that other person. Yeah, you're absolutely empowering them. Mm. And that too is a key element of Jumpseat leadership. It's about creating the space to lift others up. So when the time is right, they're empowered and able to take the lead.
Yeah, it's so transferable. And I've done presentations as well to the NHS about CRM, about threat and error management. And it's very relatable, particularly to the Air Force, where there is a rank. Because like it or not, in the medical world, there is a hierarchy. There are doctors, there are consultants, there are registrars, there are junior doctors, there are nurses, and it goes on and on. So a little bit like the Air Force. And as you say, when you jump into an aircraft as a squadron commander, you automatically have that rank. You are automatically the boss, and you're wearing a uniform that says that. And I think that makes it quite hard. I go back to my days in the Air Force, certainly on Nimrods, and we had some dinosaurs who did not listen, who would not listen. And it's quite interesting. And I'd like to think now that all gone, and certainly, my civilian career, what's that now, 19 years. Yeah, back then we used to see helicopter crews, some helicopter captains, particularly the old and bold from the North Sea, who'd survived, some fairly horrendous weather and events and even accidents, and they were very much like that. But that I'm hoping now that's gone, and certainly in what I understand, it's gone. But when I hark back to the NHS, there, it's sometimes very difficult, and it's something I really enjoy, and I've really enjoyed presenting. But it's sometimes difficult to get that message through that this has to come right from the top, and that's one of the first things we always said.
So we all have the opportunity to see. You see, ego comes from one place. It comes from fear. Fear is triggered when we sense our life is in danger, but it's also triggered when we sense our livelihood, status, or reputation is under threat. And when fear is triggered for those reasons, it's not helpful because it often shows up as ego. So, the trick here is to, when we feel ego in ourselves or see it in others coming forward, to recognize it as a warning flag that we're being driven by fear. Now, the flip side, we always have a choice. The flip side is love. Now, when you mention the word love in a business context, people start to get a little bit jittery.
Yeah, quite unusual to see that in the book until I read that chapter.
Well, yeah, but, it's important what love looks like in business. It's not about hugging trees and each other all the time. It's about being connected to something greater than yourself. It's about having a stand for something rather than being afraid of something. It's about seeing the world as a place of possibility rather than a place of scarcity. It's about thinking of others rather than yourself. And when you see ego arise because your status or reputation or livelihood is under threat, when we recognize it as a warning flag, we have the opportunity to source ourselves from a place of love. And instead of ego, to lead with humble confidence. And humble confidence is about being absolutely resolute on where you're heading, what your mission is, or your goal, your value, your vision. But having the humility to listen to others and get their input, still have confidence in your own ability, but being willing to listen to others. And I recount a story in the book about the greatest demonstration of humble confidence I had when I was the co-pilot on a VC-10 and we're faced with crash landing the aircraft with 140 people on board because the left-hand main undercarriage didn't come down. And the captain at the time turned to me and he said, "Peter, I want you to do the crash landing." Now, he wasn't abdicating his responsibility, far from it. He was an experienced captain, but not on that type. I was more experienced on that type. I was at the top of my game. I was flying the Prime Minister. I was one of the Prime Minister's pilots at the time. And also, I just practiced crash landing in the simulator a couple of weeks beforehand. So, he set aside ego and led with humble confidence because he was connected to what's the bigger picture here. The bigger picture is we all get on the ground safely and walk away. And he deemed that the best way of achieving that was to give me control of the aeroplane and support me so as I could do the best possible job I could, and for him to focus on, well, what happens when all the noise stops when we're down, then let's manage that situation. So that was humble confidence in action. So this is the thing, even when we're not the most senior in the room, when we see egos arise, we can choose to step forward with humble confidence. Because just like ego can spread, it's infectious. Egos can, raise up other egos.
Yeah.
So can humble confidence if someone shows the courage to lead from that place.
Yeah. You mentioned, I think that was the one where it was at the gear incident. I don't want to give too much away; those people won't want to read the book. But that was the gear incident, and I also one of the other ones I think, which was slightly more amusing. Well, certainly from a pilot's point of view, was I think the Jeffrey Howe incident, which resulted in some broken crockery, fine china, and crystal.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to give it. I'm not going to say it because I got hook, line, and sinker into that the way you wrote that, and I thought, oh, well, I don't really like that. And then of course it was the way you've written it, which is very clever, and it wasn't actually what the captain did. And standing back is always the thing. I mean, we teach people in the simulator quite often, when there's an emergency, is that the natural reaction for a captain to say, "I'll take control." But of course, like in industry, what you really need to do is stand back if you've got the confidence in the other person and look at the bigger picture. Because in aviation, as we know, quite often if you've got your hands and feet on the controls, that's, well, certainly when I'm flying, that's like 90% of my capacity gone. So, but again, standing back is something that I've learned as well, is that you just quite often when something happens, again, it's an aviation thing where there's an emergency, sit on your hands. I just wrote a little bit about 60 seconds. There's one of the American crews. They literally start a stopwatch. So when it's all going wrong, not particularly in the air, but at any other stage in briefing, where they get their iPhone and they put the timer on and they start it and they sit there for 60 seconds and say nothing. And at the end of it, they've generally thought of something else. So all of this harks back because we all have to make, in business, we all have to make decisions sometimes quite quickly. And it's really easy, like in the aircraft scenario, to rush in and not trust that person or not think about that other person that you've got that's probably a subject matter expert. I mean, I'm asked on a daily basis about things that I really have no idea about. But because of my title, people go, "Oh, well, we'll ask Chris because he will know that." And of course, a lot of the time I don't. It's impossible, as in anything in business, to know absolutely every subject. But I do know people that do. And I think that's the whole premise of some of the chapters. Sorry, Peter.
They're limited by their own knowledge when they supposedly know all the answers. But just linking back to something you said there, Chris, which I think is really important. And yes, we can take the flight deck of an aircraft as the example, but this translates into business as well. When someone more junior than you is making a mistake or not getting it right, in that moment, we have the opportunity to either have it spiral down or have it spiral up. Spiral down looks like pricking their balloon of confidence and taking control. Spiraling up is doing the absolute minimum necessary to ensure that you complete whatever it is successfully. So there is a story in the book called 4 Red Lights. And that's the story of me flying with a junior co-pilot into Gander, Newfoundland. And the 4 red lights refer actually to the PAPIs, the precision approach indicators. And as listeners will know, most large airfields, you've got these, and they can either shine red or shine white. If they all shine red, you're too high above the glide slope on the approach.
Too low.
If they're all red, you're way too low.
Yeah.
And if you've got 2 red and 2 white, you're good. You're on the slope. And we're flying into Gander, and it started off fine. We were 2 red, 2 white. That was good. But then it went 3 red, 1 white. We were below the glide slope. So I called to the co-pilot, let's call him John. I said, below the slope. And he should have put some power on just to regain the correct approach path. But he didn't. So I let it continue. But then I could see it drifting into 4 reds. Now, at that point, the aircraft was in danger of going into a regime beyond which I would not be able to safely recover. But even then, I didn't take control. I called out low on the approach. I then nudged the throttles forwards, calling out what I was doing as I did so. And we very quickly regained the correct approach path, and we landed without any further incident. Now, the point there was that, there was a time when, I think it's a Spock out of Star Trek quote, isn't it, where the needs of the many overcome the needs of the one. And that was such a case. But I've laid out in the book some things to consider before we do take back control, whether it's flying or in business generally. And one of the things is do the minimum absolutely necessary, because if you prick that balloon of confidence in that individual, it can take months or even longer for them to regain where they were before that moment. There is a great follow-on story to that in the book, but I'll let you...
We won't do the whole book. Maybe it's a chapter I haven't read. Maybe it's at the end.
Well,
No, and taking control is, again, it fits both industry and aviation, as you said. And quite difficult in aviation, actually. Something that we run up against at the time is sometimes it does take a lot more courage actually to take control. And that's something that we see and we practice. How far do you take it? How far do you let somebody go before actually there's probably more damage? And as you said in your Star Trek quote, it's the needs of the many, really, in that situation. And we've seen accidents. I've certainly seen an accident since I've been a civilian pilot, where during the subsequent debrief that I was involved in, and I won't go into too much detail, but the co-pilot said I was about to say something. And I think, again, in business, if you create the right atmosphere, then people who are, I don't even like the expression your juniors, but people that are in the business with you will be more happy to speak up. And that goes back to CRM, that goes back to all the stuff that we just talked about. Yeah. So in industry, Peter, what is particularly, since you've been around industry and your time with Simon, is there any one thing that you've seen that's inspired you, that along this theme, I suppose, in business?
Absolutely. And again, I'll draw from the book because it's such a great example. There's been a lot of companies, their culture and the way they lead have inspired me, but most recently, it was spending time and getting to know Nick Bainton. And Nick, until fairly recently, was CEO of ASOS, the global, based in the UK, but global fashion and jewelry retailer. And their operation is absolutely phenomenal. They've got something like over 850 brands, the numbers now, 400,000 different product lines. When something is photographed in their studios in the morning to go on their website, it's on their website in the afternoon, available in all sizes and available to be shipped to 200 territories around the world. The operation is almost like a military operation. It needs that discipline. And yet when you go around their headquarters in London, you wouldn't think there would be that discipline at all. The average age of the 4,000 people they have employed, the average age is just 27 years old.
That's amazing.
That's the average.
Yeah.
And when you walk around their headquarters, people are sitting in groups on the floor with diagrams and sketches, and there's fashion, there's clothes teeming out of every drawer and cupboard. It looks chaotic, but no, it has military precision. And that is because when I look at ASOS and Nick Baton, he encouraged Jumpseat leadership. He was all about lifting people up, for them to bring who they truly are to the workspace and make that contribution that only they could make, and delegating down to the lowest possible level. And he absolutely walks the talk, and he empowers people and lifts them up. And so ASOS is really a fantastic organization, the way it's organized. So yeah, that's why they take up the best part of a chapter in the book.
I think that's the chapter I've just started.
All right, chapter 12, I think it is.
Oh,
yeah.
There we go.
Yeah,
yeah. I would have loved, I suppose, too late for me now, but I would love to have worked in one of these organizations, because it's the way it's changed, the way the whole business has changed. And even, even in a short period of time, these online companies, the e-commerce companies, the logistics and the whole operation is just incredible. But as you say, then to have that atmosphere in the headquarters where it's a young headquarters to start off with, it's just amazing. It's phenomenal to watch. I mean, I suppose I don't know how Amazon compares, probably completely different leadership style. But
possibly, I haven't looked into Amazon, but
yeah. But you look at these; they're just truly amazing. I mean, I needed a rubber grommet for my aircraft, which I'm going down to see tomorrow. So I haven't said hello to it for a couple of months. And I went on Amazon last night and ordered. It's wrong, but it was cheaper to order a box of 100 of different sizes than it was to find one. And it arrived, as we were talking just before we came on, the DPD driver, the Amazon driver arrived, this afternoon, and the logistics behind that are just mind-boggling.
Well, they are mind-boggling. Of course, there are other issues that come up with that in terms of what leadership style drives that.
Yeah,
and. That's perhaps another conversation. But
yeah, well, I suppose that leads on. That was my other question. Is there anything that you've seen? And obviously, we don't want to get sued, or I don't want my podcast to end prematurely. But is there anything you've seen without naming names? That I think I wrote.
Yeah.
Truly horrifies you. I mean, I certainly have. But is there anything of note?
Well, I think again, I mentioned this in the book. Excuse me. There was a company, very, very, very large company with lots of divisions, one of the largest in the world. And I was running a workshop for their leadership team. And the company was in trouble, had been for some years. And the process I was taking them through would have opened up an opportunity for them to start turning it around. But there was so much ego in the room. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, Chris,
Yep.
Ego, and it came from fear. But instead of working together, they were pitting themselves against one another. And ego took the fall. The only person who didn't have ego, but sadly didn't have humble confidence either, was the CEO. He could have stepped in and raised the bar so they're working together in service to something greater than themselves, but he chose not to. He's no longer the CEO, and the company's still not doing well. But it was a shocking example of how, it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, and that's the sad thing, isn't it?
It is.
Particularly for you, if you've been brought in to advise and to guide, and then people still won't listen. That's really sad. And again, something that happens quite a bit.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
It does. We always have a choice. We can choose to be driven by fear, or we can choose to be driven by the love for something.
Yeah. And there's some great other examples in the book of that, I must say.
There are indeed, yeah.
Great. One of the things that I was going to ask you about is succession, because leading from the jump seat obviously leads into the position where you need somebody to take over. And something that I've seen is that businesses are very happy while everything's going really well with those people that are in place, and then a key figure leaves or decides to leave, and there is no understudy. Is that something that you've seen? Or I see succession as really important. I see it as part of the leadership skills, and trying to making sure that, that there is somebody ready and waiting, to step, I suppose not to step into your shoes, because I think you described that in the book as well, where you took on a different persona because you wanted, because of the person. It's a natural thing to do that the person before. And again, I've seen that lots of times where people try and be the manager that was, and it's not them. But succession is, do you see that as, a very important part of business?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it goes to the essence of what leading from the jump seat is all about. But I'd put it this way. If you're at work working on something that you believe in, something that's really important to you, why wouldn't you want it to continue after you've taken a step back? Why would you want to create a situation where when you've done your 20, 30 years or whatever it happens to be, it doesn't continue? It just evaporates. And that's what happens if you don't lift others up, if you don't prepare others to carry forward those things that are deeply important to you. I think, going back to our Air Force days, we perhaps took this for granted, but every 2.5 years, squadron commanders would change.
Yeah.
And we would have a system with flight commanders, if you like, middle management, and so on and so forth, such that no one was indispensable. And the ethos, the mission, it continued regardless of whether you ultimately were there or not. And that gave the organization great resilience. Now, of course, it came from the slightly dark side of, in combat, you lose people. And if you lose a key figure, you can't just stop. You've got to be able to continue. That's why there's rank structure there.
Although it did have its, I suppose it did have its downfalls, that a lot of people moved on before all their mistakes could be uncovered. That was certainly sometimes my experience in the Air Force.
It's true. I'm running hard, Chris, so I'm continuing to run hard, and hopefully won't catch up there. But you're right. I think it's, at least it forced the organization to look at, well, who's next? Let's do some succession planning. And that usually is an afterthought in many organizations, which seems ridiculous, actually. Why would you want everything you've worked on for so long just be at risk because you haven't equipped people?
It sometimes becomes, in smaller businesses, I've seen a lot, and I was guilty of this when I ran my own business, it becomes your baby. And that's quite dangerous. And I see it now where people should have retired and are still clinging on in there because it becomes your everything. It does literally become like a child to you, and that's quite dangerous. And quite often these businesses fade away because of it.
Yeah, well, and that's another form of ego, I think, which I don't make you or anybody else wrong for thinking that, but it's a warning sign. Even now, everything that we're developing from the book, the training courses that we're developing, part of the plan is not to make it absolutely dependent on me.
Yeah.
So obviously I'm the author, I'm the face of the book, but if the objective, as it is, to share these ideas with as many people as possible, then it has to be in a form that isn't ultimately dependent on me being there. Yeah, so
that's brilliant.
Put it into practice.
Peter, it's been really, really interesting. And I genuinely have, I'm not blowing smoke from anywhere. I really have enjoyed the book so far. It's a very practical leadership book, and I think it has a lot of value for anybody, not just managers. You mentioned, I think it was towards the end of the book, or it may have been in the preface, that everyone is capable of achieving something extraordinary. Do you have, is there just a just to finish off, I want to finish off on a. We've talked sometimes a little bit negatively about business, but of course there are some. We've talked about ASOS, which is incredible. Is there one thing that you can think of where you see someone doing something extraordinary? It doesn't have to be in business; it could be anything.
Well, I'm going to take this right back to when I was in my early teens. And I got to know two remarkable people, Muriel and Frank. They were married. And I got to know them because my mother helped to look after them. Muriel, she'd caught polio when she was 16 years old. She was going to be an Olympic swimmer, but she'd become bedridden, paraplegic for several decades. And her husband, Frank, had been a Royal Marine Commando during the Second World War. And because of conditions he was exposed to, he had difficulty walking. But these people were the two most remarkable people that I had the privilege to know when I was growing up, because their determination to carry on moving forward with their lives, to live as normal a life as possible, the joy that they brought to other people's lives was disproportionate compared to what they had around them and their physical ability. And so here's the thing, we all have the opportunity to be a pebble in the pond. By that I mean what we say and what we do, the smallest actions can have such recurring implications and positive ripples for others. And we never know how far those ripples go. And so at the end of the day, I think most of us, we want to spend our lives the way that is somehow significant. We make a difference. And what I say is, if you want to be significant, think small. It's those small actions, those moments, one-to-one interactions you have with people on a daily basis that can be that pebble in the pond. And that's the difference that we can make. Yeah. So be the pebble in the pond.
I really like that. That is true, and it's easy. Our lives are all so busy. We're all doing this technology thing. We're constantly attached to screens, attached to phones, and that I really like the idea that just one small thing each day. My wife always says to me I should write down 3 good things that I've done that day when I go to bed. Apparently that's a good coaching skill. I sometimes struggle with that. Being in charge of, not in charge of, that's the wrong expression, but being responsible for around about 80 pilots, it's sometimes a little bit of a struggle to think of that. But it's true, and if you can do it, and I think over the last 2 years we've seen lots of examples of that. Not everyone can be the CEO of ASOS, but everyone can do that small thing that you just mentioned.
It is, and let's just put a finger on that, which is a small thing can look like just pausing and checking in with someone as you pass them in the corridor. How's things at home? Kids all right? I heard your mother wasn't well. Is she doing all right? And the more senior we are, the greater that impact has, because people know that the only finite resource that any of us have is time.
Yeah.
And when we choose to spend a few moments to be curious about someone else, it means more than any other action that we could take in that time. So, be curious, and it only takes a few moments, and we can transform someone's outlook on their day.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. So what comes next? Another book? Well, I think you mentioned training courses.
Yeah, well, we're working hard at the moment to produce a training course, which will now enable Jumpseat leadership to be spread across a company at scale without complete dependency on me. So that's fun. There'll be a facilitator, a companion guide to that. And also we're working on a Consider This book, which will be an expansion of the ideas at the end of most of the chapters in the current book, to help people put into practice and embed the ideas of Jumpseat leadership in their everyday lives and their workplace. So, quite a few things on over the next few weeks.
Good. And where can you get the book? I was very lucky to have been sent one, but thank you very much. But
you're welcome. So it's available on Amazon, usual places, bookstores.
Sure.
It's available in hardback, paperback, ebook, and also audiobook. So you should be able to find it.
We'll put some links in the show notes as well, obviously, to the book. My very last question, I ask everyone this, and you can answer this in any which way you'd like, and I'm sure it'll be your answer will be very interesting. Is what do you think the world will look like in 5 years' time? And that can mean anything. I don't need some deep philosophical answer unless you want to give one.
Well, of course, it depends where we choose to look, what area of life. But let's look at a business perspective. And I think that the companies in the future that are going to thrive are those that aren't so much focused about pay and benefits, but are focused on truly caring for their people. Because here's the thing, when we care for people, it gives them a sense of belonging. And when people feel that they belong to a team or an organization, then they choose to step up and take responsibility and contribute more. So if you want your organization, your team to thrive, care for your people and have them feel that they belong. Great.
Thanks, Peter. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I think we've run way over probably what we originally were going to, but I've really, really enjoyed it. And I hope everyone else does. And it's been my pleasure. And I'd love to speak to you again soon. Maybe once the next Peter Docker book is out, we'll speak again.
Excellent. Well, it's been a delight, Chris. Thank you so much for your questions. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks to Peter for what I'm sure you will agree has been a fascinating insight, not only to Peter's career, but also how the skills learnt in aviation are so transferable to other walks of life, including business. Check out the show notes to find Peter's website and also a link to where you can buy his latest book. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have. Please visit the Busy Aviation website at www.busyaviation.co.uk to read or listen to more aviation business articles and podcasts. Take a moment to sign up to our newsletter for all the latest news, views and reviews. And if you run an aviation business and would like to appear on this podcast, please drop me a line using the contact form on the website. Take care and fly safe.